Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hi there, welcome to Brazier. Fast-paced news today from 4 until 6 in the next hour. The latest on a man being charged under the Treason Act for threatening the Queen with a crossbow. Also, as the typical household energy bill heads towards £3,600 a year this winter, energy giant BP today reported its biggest quarterly profit for 14 years. Last week, Shell also announced record earnings of nearly £10 billion. The firms are already paying billions in extra taxes and financing pension funds. So are we right to be miffed at such bumper profits? Also this hour, Tory leadership hopeful Liz Truss has backtracked on her plan to link public sector pay to local living costs. At a hustings event in Exeter, the Foreign Secretary had said she wanted to introduce regional pay boards in a bid to save a potential £8 billion. The political commentator Patrick O'Flynn will have his say. Meanwhile, could Rishi Sunak be hot on the heels of his rival? New polling suggests he's closer than we might have thought. We'll discuss that with the pollster Adam Drummond. And the US has assassinated the leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, in a drone strike in Afghanistan. The American President Joe Biden confirmed the news following the operation in the Afghan capital. Reaction with Chris Phillips, former head of the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office. With me for the next 2 hours, the editor of The Oldie, Harry Mount. But first, the latest news headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. Good afternoon. The top story today, a man who was arrested carrying a crossbow in the grounds of Windsor Castle has been charged under the Treason Act. Police say 20-year-old Jaswant Singh Chail from Southampton is accused of intending to injure or alarm Her Majesty the Queen. He was intercepted on Christmas Day last year. He'll appear in court later this month. Politics, and Tory leadership candidate Liz Truss has abandoned a proposed policy to slash public sector pay for workers outside of London. At the hustings in Exeter, where she appeared with the Tory party faithful, we can tell you she claimed the plan would save nearly £9 billion. Labour and senior Conservatives criticised the move, saying the policy would level down the country. BP has reported a profit of nearly £7 billion for the second quarter. That's the biggest in 14 years. That's as rising oil and gas prices hit UK households with inflation at its highest in 40 years. The consultancy Cornwall Insight has warned energy bills could reach more than £3,600 this winter. That's hundreds of pounds more than previously predicted for England, Wales and Scotland. Air Travel and British Airways has suspended the sale of short-haul flights from Heathrow for at least a week. The move affects domestic and European services, with the airline saying it's in response to Heathrow's request to limit new bookings. Last month, the airport announced a daily limit of 100,000 passengers until at least mid-September. The Supreme Court has received an urgent appeal from the family of Archie Battersby following a midday deadline of withdrawing him from his life support treatment. The 12-year-old's family now await a decision, and the hospital say they won't withdraw treatment until they have direction from the court. Archie was found unconscious at his home in April and was declared brain dead by doctors. Ella Carter, a friend of the Battersby family, says they're hopeful the Supreme Court will accept the appeal.
The family are disappointed that it was sort of dealt with as quickly as it was, but we're hopeful that the Supreme Court will accept our appeal and it will be given the proper consideration it deserves.
International news, and the Speaker of the US House of Representatives has landed in Taiwan. That's despite a warning from China's leader, Xi Jinping, that the trip would put Washington on a collision course with Beijing, undermining relations. China was backed by Russia, describing the visit as provocative. Both countries opposed the independence of Taiwan. As you were hearing from Colin, a US drone strike has killed the leader of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Ayman al-Zawahiri, one of the world's most wanted terrorists, helped plan the 9/11 attacks and was Osama bin Laden's successor. President Joe Biden says he was killed in a counter-terrorism operation over the weekend in Kabul after evading the US for nearly 21 years.
On Saturday, at my direction, the United States successfully concluded an airstrike in Kabul, Afghanistan, that killed the emir of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now, justice has been delivered, and this terrorist leader is no more.
Joe Biden. Former defence advisor to President Bush, Jamil Jaffer, told GB News this airstrike's a huge win for the White House and for the world.
To be sure, al-Qaeda will try to regroup and will appoint a new leader, probably Sirajuddin Haqqani, a member of the Afghan government and the former head of the Haqqani network. But al-Qaeda, for now at least, is been worn down. They will come back, though, and the key is to keep the pressure on them, both in the United States to prevent attacks in the United States, but also against our allies in the UK and Europe.
Here, an arrest warrant has been issued for the older brother of the Manchester Arena bomber after he didn't turn up to give evidence at the public inquiry into the 2017 attack. Ismail Abedi, who fled the UK last summer, failed to attend the hearing at Manchester Magistrates Court today. Last month, the 29-year-old was found guilty in his absence of failing to comply with a notice which compelled him to cooperate with the inquiry. That's it. More news as it happens. Now back to Brazier.
Well, BP has today announced its biggest quarterly profits for 14 years, even as customers are hit with the news that household energy bills could soar to almost £4,000 a year come this winter. The energy giant saw underlying profits hit £6.9 billion, more than triple the amount BP made at the same time last year. Last week, Shell announced bumper profits too, nearly £10 billion. There are those calling on the government to introduce a tougher windfall tax on oil and gas firms, the profits they make. Others point out the firms pay billions in tax already of varying flavours, whilst helping our pension funds stay solvent. And though this year the companies have done well, very well, of course some years they actually lose money. Let's turn to Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Energy Policy and Tech at Imperial College, Malcolm Grimston, who's here in this studio alongside Harry Mount, who's going to be with me for the next 2 hours. Malcolm, the point to make there about there being good years and bad bumper years and fallow years, do they balance each other out?
You can't take a very short period of time. There's a cycle with any heavy capital intensive industry. If, say, we start at a point of high prices, so they invest because they can make money out of it. The investment comes online, that increases supply, so prices start to come down. You then have a period of low prices, you have consolidation, companies not making much money, combining together. That begins to push the price back up again, and it reaches a point where the cycle goes round again. Now, as you mentioned, a couple of years ago, BP were posting losses because we have had a period of quite low oil prices historically until the last year. We can step in and take money off these companies at this stage, but ultimately what that will mean is they won't do the investment bit of the cycle. It's often said the cure to high prices is high prices, because that's what provides the money to make the investment to bring the prices down again.
Harry, it's so easy to kick big oil, but actually they do put a lot of money, for instance, into things like pension funds. Oh, and they employ lots of people.
Yes, and as you said, they're already paying a huge amount of tax, even before that windfall tax that came in a few months ago. And also, as you said, a couple of years ago, the oil price was in fact negative, and those two majors, BP and Shell, were losing a huge amount of money. No one was suggesting we should step forward and bail them out. This is the price you pay for taking the risk, is you can lose a lot and can also make a lot. I think it's just very unfair that oil companies are attacked in a way that other companies aren't. So when AstraZeneca, quite rightly, makes a fortune out of its various vaccines and pharmaceuticals, no one suggests we should do a windfall tax on them.
Fascinating point, Malcolm. Do you see that? I mean, and if it's true, and I suspect it's at least half true, why?
Yes, because energy, for first thing, it's really in your face. You know, the energy bill comes to us every month. We fill the car up with petrol. Yeah. It's very, very immediate for us. And there is also an environmental angle. Some of these oil companies over the years have not behaved as well as they should in terms of local environmental effects, and we're now concerned about climate change. But we can't have it both ways. We could pay for all of this out of public money, but then it would be competing with the health service and with education and with the police and all the things that are frankly a bit sexier, rather than saying we're going to make an investment now because we think it'll bring your power prices down in 15 years. And we've seen that the state doesn't always do this terribly well. If we're going to do it with private money, which makes a lot of sense, then those companies have to be allowed to make a reasonable profit over the whole cycle. And inevitably that means times when they're not making anything and times when they're making quite a lot.
And in summary, and you come at this not as a cheerleader for the industry, but in summary, to those who are saying, yes, we've got a windfall tax, let's make it that little bit bigger, you say...
Well, the problem with windfall taxes generally is that they are retrospective, that they say to companies, invest if you like, but if you make money, we're going to take it off you. And at that point, then we're in danger of the worst of both worlds, where the prices are very high, but the money isn't going to investments because the companies are afraid of future policy, so it all goes to the shareholders. And yes, the pension fund point is a good one, but most shareholders are not pension funds, they're companies or private individuals. And so we get the worst of both worlds, high prices, but not the investment going in to reduce the prices.
And Harry, there's a moral, I'm not sure, maybe moral's not the right word, but let's use it anyway. There is a moral hazard question here, the morality of the thing. It's what they do in Venezuela. Companies make too much money, legally, entirely legally, and the state says, we'll have that tar.
Yes, exactly. And if you take it to its extreme, you get Venezuela, naturally a very, very rich country in resources, being near collapse. And if you were to tax BP and Shell to death, other majors would come pouring in from across the world. American oil companies, I think I'm right in saying, Malcolm, reported huge profits last month as well. So they'll just step in.
And Mr. Putin will continue making huge amounts of money by selling his gas and oil because we haven't invested in our own.
Hey, let's have BP and Shell, not Gazprom. Can I say that? Yeah, I think I can. Malcolm, thanks very much indeed. We're going to take you back to the race for number 10 now, and the Tory leadership hopeful Liz Truss has this afternoon backtracked on her plan to link public sector pay to local living costs. There was that hustings in Exeter last night, quite an interesting one actually, and the Foreign Secretary, amongst other things, said she wanted to introduce regional pay boards in a bid to save a potential nearly £9 billion. A backlash of sorts from several senior Tories then followed. In a statement, the Liz Truss team have said current levels of public sector pay will absolutely be maintained. Anything to suggest otherwise is simply wrong. At the hustings event last night, the former leadership hopeful Penny Mordaunt backed Liz Truss to be the next Prime Minister.
Who is going to hold seats and win back councils? And who most embodies the vision and values the British public had in their heads and their hearts when they voted in 2016 and 2019. At the start of this final phase of the contest, I didn't know the answer to those questions, but I've seen enough to know who the person I'm going to put my faith in is. And that is Liz Truss.
So Penny Mordaunt there coming out for Liz Truss. We're joined here in the studio by the political commentator Patrick O'Flynn. Patrick, you're very welcome, and you're very welcome to talk about the backtrack if that's what it is. But I'm really interested in the other question that arose there. Well, it's two other questions. How dismissive she was of Nicola Sturgeon. Now you can say that's easily done, but she is democratically elected. Nicola Sturgeon, and occupies a very significant role within our British constitutional framework, so we might come on to that. But saying, as Liz Truss did say last night, that there can be no more lockdowns. Really?
Well, I think her general sentiment will be widely approved of by the Tory membership, but it's the unqualified nature...
That's the point. Nobody wants lockdowns.
No, but if, for instance, we had, heaven forbid, an outbreak of airborne Ebola with a infection fatality rate of 50%.
And it took off the kids.
Yeah, then I can tell you there would be lockdowns. So I think it registered all right with her audience, and I've seen a lot of social media from people who were very anti-lockdown who've taken it to heart. But it wasn't necessarily that statesman-like a thing to say or way to pitch it.
Harry, is this the gap between what she is saying to the faithful at that hustings and who are voting, and what she would subsequently actually say to the electorate? Is that gap getting bigger?
I'm sure there's an element of that, and she has to toss red meat at them, particularly if, as your report suggested, Rishi Sunak might be making up ground. But I thought she was a bit too triumphalist last night. That audience, as your clip just showed, clapping her to the rafters. And you will both remember that moment, was it 92, with Kinnock saying, well, all right, at Sheffield. The rally. It's not as extreme as that, but if I were her, I'd be a bit careful. She's in the lead. She shouldn't be too triumphalist. And her remark about Nicola Sturgeon, I thought, was very silly. I'm no fan of Nicola Sturgeon, but I'm not the possible future Prime Minister. She's going to have to talk to her, isn't she?
Was it glib, Patrick, the Nicola Sturgeon?
Well, perhaps
she said, just for those who don't know, she said Nicola Sturgeon's an attention seeker. Well, all politicians are attention seekers, aren't they?
Yes, and people have posted pictures of Liz Truss on battle tanks and things like that. But I think with the audience, it worked, and I don't personally think that one does her any damage in the members' ballot. But I do think if you're in Liz Truss's camp, you might be saying to her now, look,
don't take any risks.
You're well ahead.
Yeah.
The ballots have landed on Monday and Tuesday. Probably 2/3 of members will fill it in and post it off by Friday. You're into that stage where you're carrying the precious Ming vase across the crowded room. You don't need to do any kind of pirouettes and flash stuff. And yet the public sector pay proposal, I think, that's fallen apart today, I think that has done her a bit of damage. I wouldn't get wild about it. I still think personally that she will win by at least 60-40 if she just calms it down for the next week or so.
We're about to talk to a pollster, and what do you make of those suggestions that the poll lead that she enjoys is narrowing, and to the point where actually it's not quite neck and neck, but near enough?
No, I disagree with that. And the poll that I think the Times covered this morning, is very hard to get to the bottom of that, of how they've constructed their sample. Some of the subheading results just are very puzzling. I personally don't place that much stock in that poll. And the grassroots Tories that I speak to, quite a few of them around the country, they're still very strongly of the opinion that Liz Truss is much further ahead than that.
Patrick, while we've got you, one final thought. Are you enjoying the ventilation of Conservative ideas, particularly around tax? There's a way of looking at this whole process that sees it as self-defeating and actually providing lots of ammo for the opposition in a future general election. But is there another more positive way of looking at it, which is actually Conservatism is looking at itself hard in the mirror?
Yeah, well, I thought Kemi Badenoch brought that kind of battle of ideas in and really fizzed and refreshed, and I was very sad that she didn't make the final two. I personally also think Liz Truss has been right to challenge Rishi Sunak about tax, and he's the one who's been in reverse gears on that, and I think she had a better appreciation than him about the full extent of the living standards crisis that's coming down the road. Probably felt at its most acute late autumn, early winter, and that, you know, his problem is he's delivered effectively 3 or 4 budgets already this year and never really got ahead of the curve, and I think that's a very telling criticism.
It's hard to get ahead of the curve when the Russians are still playing with the gas taps going into Europe, but it's another story, isn't it? Patrick, thanks so much for coming in. Appreciate it. Thank you. I mentioned the pollsters. The race for number 10 might be a bit closer than we think, despite a recent YouGov survey suggesting Liz Truss had a 24-point lead over Rishi Sunak with Tory members. A private poll released this week claims the gap is actually closer to 5 points. The pollster and head of political research at Opinium, Adam Drummond, joins us now. Adam Drummond, welcome to you. This is a big range of potential outcomes.
Yeah, it is. And as your colleague was just saying, it's hard to know how much stock to put into each one. Although if I was forced to choose, I would err on the side of the YouGov survey showing Truss is ahead by about 24 points, just because they've got more of a track record. They've done this several times before in several previous leadership elections, and they've got a good record of it. So I would say that, although I would point out that as polling challenges go, doing party membership is really quite challenging, especially for the Conservatives who don't put out public information about how to make your sample representative of the Tory membership. It's such a niche audience, you're really kind of struggling to get, take whatever you can get, and it's hard to make that as accurate as you'll get with general public polls.
Adam, is that partly because the Tory members just don't trust pollsters?
It's mainly because there's so few of them. There's about 150, 160,000 or so. If you are doing this, if you imagine how many phone calls you'd have to make to get that incidence of people, especially if you don't have the database to actually start making those. If you're trying to do it online, the proportion of people who are going to be on your panel who are going to be Tory members, we're talking, 0.1% or less than that of the population. So it's really, really tiny numbers. You have to do a lot of verification to make sure they actually are Conservative Party members. It's really just because it's such sort of needle in the haystack stuff that it's really hard to get in the first place.
Yeah, and we mentioned in the introduction private polling, because, if you are Rishi Sunak and you're trying to calibrate to what extent you go on the attack, to what extent you pull a rabbit out of the hat, let's talk about, as you did only a couple of days ago, cutting income tax by 4p in the pound. I mean, gigantic policy rabbits, guided to some degree by how he feels he's doing in the polls.
Yeah, there's always a pinch of salt you have to put next to any kind of claim about private polling. Like, why is that being released? Why are people taking their internal data and releasing it, especially if it differs from what the public data is saying? Now, just on our behalf, we don't put much extra sort of special sauce in the stuff we do for private clients versus what we put out publicly. It's largely the same method. The results we get are largely going to be similar. So if you do have something that's showing a very different picture, yes, as I've said, it's a really hard race to poll. It's a really difficult sample to get, but I would be a bit skeptical of anything showing wildly different results. Although, like I said, it's difficult. Maybe we'll all end up with egg on our face at the end of this if Rishi Sunak pulls it off.
Adam Drummond is the head of political research at Opinion. Adam, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. Harry Mount is alongside me. Just as a digression, a lot of these big opinion pollsters, a lot of the work they do actually is private polling. It's for business. It's something people don't necessarily understand about the way these pollsters work. They make a lot of their money polling for businesses, and a lot of the results never reach the open air, never get published. I'll park that particular thought. Is it interesting? Is it done and dusted? Is it Liz Truss Prime Minister? We're just counting down the days.
I'd have thought it was, because even if the lead is as little as 5%, actually, in the scheme of things, that's actually rather big for a two-horse race, isn't it? And again, possibly a self-selecting crowd in the hustings in Exeter last night. But they were extremely keen on her. Lots of them were clapping, and she had that. She seemed to have a great confidence.
She's grown into the role a bit, hasn't she? I mean, the initial view was that he's the thoroughbred. She's a bit gawky and uncomfortable in front of the cameras. And actually, I wonder.
She is fluent, but I must say, well, I've said it already, but I thought that she was a bit too excited. She obviously liking being popular, don't we all? But I didn't think she did look that impressive last night. She had perfectly good answers, even the one that's seemed to collapse today. But I'd have thought she should play it very careful over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. OK, Harry, for now, thanks very much indeed. Coming up, we've got a foreign news story, but one that will resonate for many of the Britons who remember the events of 9/11, 3,000 people killed in those attacks on New York and Washington, orchestrated by the two men pictured there, Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. Joe Biden's made sure he's claiming credit for this, what amounts to an assassination in a particularly lethal way, a missile that effectively shredded Ayman al-Zawahiri as he stood on a balcony in Kabul, but didn't kill anybody else nearby. What was the technology used to do that? We'll reflect on that and the fact that, some 66 Brits were killed in the events of 9/11 as well. So reaction to the news that the leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, has been killed in that drone strike. More to come.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation. We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GBNews.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
It is 25 minutes past 4. A missile nicknamed the Ninja has been used to assassinate the leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, in a drone strike in Afghanistan. This, we're told, was a Hellfire R9X missile. It's gruesome stuff, but this is the sort of thing we're talking about when people get killed by the military. It uses extended blades to kill rather than explosives, which is, I suppose, better in terms of collateral damage. The people, civilians and people around Zawahiri weren't killed. He was shredded, according to reports. Experts say that meant the man who plotted the 9/11 attacks alongside Osama bin Laden had been standing on a balcony in Kabul on Sunday when he was killed. Chris Phillips is the former head of the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office. Chris, welcome to you. This is one of those stories that reminds you that states, as they ought to have when it comes to profound matters of justice. This was somebody who had his fingerprints all over a plan that led to 3,000 particularly gruesome deaths, including those of more than 60 Brits. You want states to remember that justice eventually must be served.
Yeah, and I think the world's a slightly safer place today because of this attack. Listen, this man was a mass murderer. He plotted murders right across the globe. I don't think anyone should have any sympathy for him. The simple fact is the US said that they were going to go after him, and it's taken them a lot of years, but they've managed to get their man eventually. And I think it does send a message out, Colin, to all the other would-be terrorists that the US are going to track people down and eventually will kill them.
Does the psychology of the weaponry matter, Chris? I mean, I know it's macabre, but I don't raise it because it's macabre. I'm not revelling in that at all. I think it raises really important points about collateral damage, for instance, but also, if you are a fugitive from American justice or British justice, for that matter, in this part of the world, in Afghanistan or Iraq, you can be, as we're told this individual was, on a balcony. And then the next thing you know, you're being diced, you're being chopped to pieces. Oh, and by the way, the kids in the next room or the civilians downstairs are completely unharmed. I mean, it's incredible on one level.
Well, from the world of killing people, this whole drone thing is changing things dramatically. And the simple fact that they can use this type of equipment now, I mean, it does bode ill for the future, I think. But actual surgical strikes in without destroying huge bits of land and often many innocent people as well. So it is quite surgical, and that's a good thing. It killed the person that it needed to, and it didn't kill other people, which is a positive. But you're right. I think there's a lot of psychology behind this, because I think the people that do these kind of things, and don't forget, Al Qaeda hasn't disappeared. It's just reduced somewhat. These people are still out there, and they are plotting to commit these terrible terrorist attacks, and they should be in fear of their lives, because this man clearly thought that he was now safe to return to Kabul.
And it's a reminder also, I mean, you know, I don't, clearly, you know far more about how these things work than I would. And it may be the case that to some degree a lot of this was done using satellites. But I would imagine that human intelligence, you know, spies on the ground were also quite useful in identifying where al-Zawahiri was. And it's a reminder that you can't spend, as the Americans did, the best part of 2 decades in a country without leaving lots of friends behind.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point, that this man thought that he was safe back in Kabul. Clearly, the Taliban wouldn't have wanted this man killed. So there are people still within Afghanistan that really don't like this man and were willing to work for the US. And I think it does send out messages that none of these terrorists are actually safe, and they think they can get to a place of safety, but the US can get to them.
For people who, you know, lived through and remember the events of 9/11 and saw, you know, people hurling themselves from the tops of the Twin Towers, it was hard to imagine that something worse than Al-Qaeda could ever come along. But then along came ISIS, which had no problem with crucifixions and mass beheadings and mass rapes and all the rest of it. And there is that sense in which Al-Qaeda, though iniquitous indeed, wasn't as bad as things could get.
No, but this man did really start and kick off the suicide bombing piece. He was, I wouldn't say only responsible for it, but it was certainly one of his ideas that he would televise people that are going to kill themselves and kill other people as well. So Al-Qaeda are one major issue. They've been a reduced issue, and this further reduces them. It cuts the head off the snake. ISIS still exists, and both terrorist organisations, terrible that they are still active across the world, in particular across Northern Africa.
Chris Phillips, really appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. We've got some breaking news for our viewers and listeners. Let's take you to the Supreme Court. Our reporter Alice Porter is there. This concerns the case of Archie Battersby. Alice, what do you know? Hi, Alice. I hope you can hear me. It's Colin Brazier here in the studio. I think you've got some breaking news for us.
Hi there. Yes, I've just heard from the Supreme Court, and they have ruled that, has reinforced the decision from the Court of Appeal that there should not be an extension to Archie Battersby being on a life support machine. They haven't given a time frame in place, but they have reinforced the decision by the Court of Appeal, and therefore they have not sided with Archie Battersby's family, who were very much hoping, because of the United Nations intervening in the last couple of days in this, they made a request to the government for there to be Archie Battersby's life support treatment to continue. The Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the United Kingdom, they have very much sided with all the courts so far, and that is not in favour of the family. I also understand that the Health Secretary, Stephen Barclay, has also intervened in the case and has urged the Supreme Court to continue to reinforce what has been done with the Court of Appeal, and that is not to prolong the treatment for Archie Battersby on life support machine.
Thanks very much indeed. Harry Mount alongside me. These cases come along periodically. They are tragic. They're immensely difficult for the courts to pick their way through. We spare a thought, obviously, for the family, but also the clinicians who've got to make these dreadful choices too.
Yeah, and it's completely agonising, isn't it? It's one of those strange legal cases where both sides are essentially right. What parent wouldn't want their child to go on living, however terribly ill they are? But on the other hand, I mean, I don't know about you, Colin, I wouldn't want to go on living in that situation. And the state, I think, does have the right not to actively, forgive my words, kill somebody, to remove life support. So it's utter agony. You completely understand the parent's point of view. But I'm afraid I ultimately side with the Supreme Court.
I'm just looking at this legalistically, setting aside the emotion and the tears and the tragedy. The intervention, the attempted intervention of the United Nations felt odd, but it struck me the alacrity with which the British legal system said, actually, no, this is our jurisdiction. You have nothing to say about this.
Yes, no, I completely agree. Again, you can understand the UN, because who wouldn't feel terribly for that poor boy? But at the same time, they are not obviously within the hierarchy of English law. So Supreme Court should quite rightly ignore them.
Yeah, that's right, Supreme Court. Harry, thanks very much indeed. Coming up, our debate this hour, should the next Prime Minister ignore Nicola Sturgeon? The hustings event for the Tories last night in Exeter. Liz Truss called the Scottish First Minister an attention seeker. Was she right to? Also coming up after 5 o'clock, we'll discuss the Foreign Secretary's strong stance on the possibility of another lockdown. Has she backed herself into a corner, Liz Truss, by outright claiming she'd be against any more lockdowns? Nobody's for lockdowns, are they? I'm certainly not. I think they were all far too long and did untold damage. But actually, there may be circumstances where you need one. You can imagine, can't you? We'll reflect on that shortly. First, the latest news headlines with Polly.
We are GB News. We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation. We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
The latest headlines at 4:30, well, just after 4:30, a man who was arrested carrying a crossbow in the grounds of Windsor Castle on Christmas Day has been charged under the Treason Act. Police say 20-year-old Jaswant Singh Chahil from Southampton is accused of intending to injure or alarm the Queen. Tory leadership candidate Liz Truss has abandoned a proposed policy to slash public sector pay for workers outside of London. At a hustings in Exeter last night, she said the plan would save nearly £9 billion. Labour and senior Conservatives criticised the move, saying it would level down the country. BP has reported a profit of nearly £7 billion in the second quarter. That's the highest in 14 years. And it comes amid rising oil and gas prices affecting UK households, with inflation at its highest in 40 years. Consultancy Cornwall Insight says energy bills could reach more than £3,600 a year for a household this winter. And British Airways has suspended the sale of short-haul flights from Heathrow for at least a week. The airline has temporarily halted ticket sales for domestic and European services, saying it was in response to Heathrow's request to limit new bookings. Last month, Heathrow announced a limit of 100,000 passengers per day until mid-September. And an arrest warrant has been issued for the older brother of the Manchester Arena bomber after he didn't turn up to give evidence at the public inquiry into the 2017 attack. Ismail Abedi, who fled the UK last summer, failed to attend the hearing at Manchester Magistrates Court today. Those are your headlines. You're up to date on TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. You're with GB News And now we go back to Brazier.
Direct Bullion sponsors the finance report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Quick look at the finance first. The markets as they stand. The pound will buy you 1.220 US dollars and 1.198 euros. And the price of gold currently stands at £1,456 and 2 pence for an ounce.
Direct Bullion sponsors the finance report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
A story just breaking the last hour or so, and it concerns a man who was arrested carrying a crossbow in the grounds of Windsor Castle on Christmas Day, and he's been charged under the Treason Act. Police say 20-year-old Jaswant Singh Chahal from Southampton is accused of intending to injure or alarm Her Majesty the Queen. Let's turn to the former Met detective, Peter Blexley, who joins us now. Peter Blexley, welcome to you. People are focusing a little bit on the idea of the Treason Act being invoked here, and perhaps we'll touch on that. But just on the point about this particular charge concerning a crossbow, I know when this story first emerged, the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, then at the time said, we need to look a little bit more closely than we have done at the laws around crossbows. As I understand it, you'll know better, I'm sure, if you're 18, with no further legal checks, you can buy a crossbow.
Yes, indeed you can. And essentially, the age restriction is just about the only law relating to crossbows at the moment. It's an offence to sell it to someone under the age of 18. Now, Priti Patel did announce a review into the law on crossbows some months ago, and I'm rather disappointed that that hasn't delivered yet. Let's hope it won't be very far down the road. But essentially, if somebody is found carrying a crossbow in the street and they intend to use it to harm someone, then invariably they will be charged with possessing an offensive weapon as opposed to a specific crossbow charge.
But in terms of getting hold of the thing in the first instance, Peter, I mean, if I've got a shotgun, and to get that, as people who have shotguns know and use them for a country in country sports, to get one, you've got to jump through lots of hoops. You've got to prove you're not crackers to the local police force, and it's stored securely. My point is, you're put through the runner. I can't see that much difference in terms of lethality between a shotgun and a crossbow, and yet one's heavily regulated and governed, and the other just isn't.
But then perhaps it's not a huge leap from a crossbow to a bow and arrow, for example. And there are, of course, archery clubs the length and breadth of the country, which convene every weekend, and people thoroughly enjoy that Olympic sport. It's in bit of a sort of weaponry black hole, the crossbow, at the moment. Fortunately, they are rarely used, although there was one in a murder committed not so long ago. So I think the Home Secretary was absolutely right to order this review of the laws relating to them. And it may well be that perhaps before too long we'll see something going through Parliament to strengthen the laws around it, which would include the conditions that have to be met in order for somebody to purchase one.
And Peter Blexley, I mentioned the fact that this is a young man being charged under the Treason Act. And obviously, we won't get into the specifics around the charges. He's been charged, and that therefore means we're limiting what we can say about the specific allegations. But just the idea of the Treason Act, comes with lots of historical baggage, to put it mildly.
Yes, it most certainly does. And I think it probably highlights perfectly the fact that the law on crossbows might need to be reviewed. Yes, these kind of treason charges are incredibly rare. And so it's probably somebody was thumbing through the statute book, perhaps, to try and find a suitable crime that fitted the circumstances. We shall see.
Peter Blexley, always good to talk to you and appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed. Harry Mount is alongside me here. Peter Blexley, Harry makes a good point there, which actually, what is, it's a spectrum, isn't it? And a crossbow is clearly a very dangerous, nay, potentially lethal weapon that can be legally bought by anybody 18 and above. You start to regulate it, you then have this cascading effect, don't you? What do you do about bow and arrows? You know, if people want to kill somebody, they'll pull out a kitchen knife. What are you going to do, ban those too?
Yes, I suppose where you draw the line, it strikes me that crossbow does sound like a very lethal thing, and I, like you, own a shotgun. I'm always really impressed by the police, how regularly they check, and I've been the referee for somebody else just now who wanted a licence. They ring up, they discuss their mental health, any drinking issues. So I wouldn't have thought it'd be too difficult to make that one step further to include crossbows. As Peter said, I think it was in Wales, someone was killed not very long ago from quite a distance. I think they are that much more lethal than a bow and arrow. I think you could draw the line there.
And just something we haven't touched upon, and it's an obvious point really, but it needs making, I think, and that is that the most famous person in the world, our Queen, does attract attention, sometimes unwanted attention, and this has happened pretty much every decade of her reign.
Yes, I mean, in the same way that it's said that most of us dream about the royal family, if you're a loony or a nutter and you want to kill someone, a complete stranger, that's one of the people you'll go for. I'm always struck on the rare occasions I see members of the royal family public events by how low-key but sophisticated their security is. And that depends, unlike in America where they have to have much more security for a president, of not having lots and lots of lethal weapons held by the people.
You're absolutely right. You're right about the walkabouts in particular. Harry, thanks very much indeed. Our debate this hour, Liz Truss facing criticism from some MPs today after making these comments about Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, at a Conservative leadership hustings last night.
I feel like I'm a child of the Union, that I really believe we are a family and we're better together. And I think the best thing to do with Nicola Sturgeon is ignore her. Look, she's an attention seeker, Seb. That's what she is. And what we need to do is show the people of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales what we are delivering for them.
Well, the Brexit Opportunities Minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg, has defended her comments, but the SNP Deputy Leader Keith Brown said the Foreign Secretary's comments made it clear that the people of Scotland mean nothing to either of the contenders for the next Tory Prime Minister. We're asking, should the next PM ignore Nicola Sturgeon? Is that even possible? We're joined by the political editor of the Scottish Daily Mail, Michael Blackley, and the former leader of Reform UK Scotland, Michelle Ballantyne. Welcome to you both. Michael, I just wonder how well judged this was by Liz Truss. I mean, this is somebody as Foreign Secretary who's used to treading a diplomatic tightrope and being deft in what they say. But this is pretty incendiary. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon isn't liked by lots of people, I dare say not necessarily even by you two. But she was elected and put into that position by a majority of the Scottish electorate, those that voted for the SNP.
I think it was quite deliberately incendiary, to be honest. I think Liz Truss was very much speaking to the Conservative membership. Nicola Sturgeon's always portrayed, whether it be in election campaigns or leadership contests, she's portrayed as a bit of a hate figure for Conservative members. So I think Liz Truss wants to get out the message to them that she's going to stand up to Nicola Sturgeon and she's not going to let her have her way. And I think that was probably what she was trying to do yesterday. It has caused a lot of controversy, but I don't think it's lost her a single vote in the leadership contest, which is, after all, what this is all about. So I think within the Conservative membership, it's gone down fairly well in Scotland and across the UK. Whether it's a strategy that's going to appeal to any new voters is another matter, and something that might become a bit more of an issue when it does come to a general election campaign.
Yeah, but as you say, Michael, she'll then be facing a different set of voters and can perhaps put a different set of propositions to them. Michelle, I suppose prima facie, actually ignoring the First Minister right now is something that the next Prime Minister sort of can do, in the sense that where we are in terms of the independence process, IndyRef 2, is very much in a legal limbo now. It's for the UK Supreme Court to rule on the legality or otherwise of plans for a second referendum. So actually, whoever's in number 10, to some degree, can be a little bit hands-off.
Yeah, and I think we need to put it in context here. She's talking about ignoring her constant calls for an IndyRef 2. I mean, she calls for it every year and has been doing so. And there comes a point where actually the Prime Minister and indeed many MPs and MSPs in other parties need to stop pandering to that platform and actually force her onto the platform to talk about the things that really matter to people, whether it's the NHS or building ships, etc. So I think it's quite important that the Prime Minister just says, actually, no, I'm not going to get dragged into this discussion. I am going to ignore you. You are just sort of attention seeking. I think that wasn't a bad description. And that constant reference to the people of Scotland. Yes, they won the Scottish election, but on a 63.5% turnout, they got 47% of the constituency vote. That is only 30% of the available votes in Scotland. So they don't speak for the majority, and I think that's something that the rest of the UK need to understand, because they have this habit, and Nicola Sturgeon is particularly guilty of this, along with her ministers, keep talking about the people of Scotland like we're one voice. We're not, and she isn't our voice.
Yeah, and of course, those of you in Scotland know that the geographic picture is very different. It depends, you may, there you are on the Scottish borders, have a different disposition politically from the central belt, and different again the further north you go. So it's complicated, isn't it? Michael Blackley, on the point about attention seeking, all politicians are attention seekers. It's what they're paid to do.
Yes, I suppose that's a fair point, and indeed some of the reaction from the SNP today is probably attention-seeking as well. They want to get out how outraged they are about these astonishing, unacceptable comments. So actually, in reality, this is what the SNP thrive on. That's perhaps where there's a bit of a risk from Liz Truss's perspective, because it maybe does play into the hands of the SNP to say that this will be a Prime Minister if she wins, that they will claim that the majority of Scotland hasn't voted for and therefore isn't popular in Scotland, and they present this as the fact that she is dismissing the voice of Scotland, when I don't think that is what it's all about. As Michelle was pointing out, I think she is keen to show that in actual fact Nicola Sturgeon isn't speaking for the majority of Scots when she is demanding a referendum at the moment. And even on that issue, I think there's just a change of tone starting to develop within the Conservative Party, especially south of the border, but also in Scotland. And I think there's just a feeling that there's a confidence that people do not want an independence referendum, and therefore people like Liz Truss are much more willing now to come out and speak in pretty forthright terms about that than in the past. It sometimes seems in the past, for all that he is pretty forthright in his views himself, sometimes it seemed like Boris Johnson was a little scared to criticise Nicola Sturgeon.
Yeah. Michelle, if Michael's right and we have passed peak independence sentiment, do you expect some of that toxic stuff that comes out of the cyber nats, as they're called, to get worse? It's a very loaded question, obviously, but I say it having had a conversation recently with somebody who gave me a list of examples of the sorts of things that was happening online and actually even in person, and to a great degree, and I expect, you both agree with me on this point, I'm sure, that is ignored by the Westminster media. There is a tone of political debate in Scotland right now which people need to pay more attention to south of the border, because it's deeply, deeply toxic.
Yes, I mean, the problem we've got is you've got a small percentage of people in Scotland who are absolutely obsessed with the idea of breaking up the UK. And it wouldn't matter what evidence was put in front of them. It wouldn't matter how bad it got. They won't put that down, and they will keep at it. And as they start to weaken, and there is a sense across the country that the whole independence conversation is weakening, and it has been undermined by Brexit. That hasn't played into their hands. It's actually played against them, because things like a hard border become much more likely. So they are getting frustrated. And this is when that toxic element of attack starts. And I was recently speaking at an event in Glasgow, and there is an underlying worry in places like Glasgow that you could see the kind of problems that Northern Ireland saw, where that separation argument, it becomes increasingly toxic. It then becomes very centred around religion. So there is an underlying worry in some parts that it could get really bad. And I think where the UK government do have a role is to pour water on that fire and to show the kind of support to Scotland and be the kind of partnership within Scotland that is positive, that actually demonstrates the power of the Union to the people of Scotland, so that it doesn't become a toxic conversation between the First Minister and the Prime Minister. It becomes much more demonstrative on the ground. And I do think we're seeing that with things like the Levelling Up funds, as that flows into Scotland to the local authorities, and people can see the benefit and see, the Union flag on things in the same way that the EU flag was put on things. Then we start to change the conversation.
Michelle Ballantyne and Michael Blackley, thanks both very much indeed for your time. Appreciate it. We have just got time for this, 5 to 5. 5 things you might want to know about before 5 o'clock. At 5, households have been warned that energy bills could continue to soar this winter, with the energy consultancy firm Cornwall Insight suggesting the average household could be paying £3,615 a year. The warning comes as energy giant BP announced its biggest profit for 14 years. At 4, British Airways has stopped selling tickets on short-haul flights from Heathrow until the 8th of August, struggling to meet demand. The suspension affecting BA flights to domestic and European destinations. At 3, hundreds of thousands of people with type 1 diabetes in England will be eligible for gadgets that keep track of their blood sugars on the NHS. The health service said it had struck a deal to buy continuous glucose monitors at a cut price, paving the way for wider access. The monitors are no bigger than a bottle cap. They measure glucose levels just under the skin and send information to a mobile app. At 2, Morrison's has launched a line of carbon-neutral eggs, hens fed on insects reared on the company's own food waste. I wonder how much actual energy is required to do that. The supermarket chain said the move will help support their drive to be directly supplied by zero-emission British farms. Well, it says in my script 2020, but that can't be right now, can it? And at 1, officials from Torbay Council have said that Patrick the Pony, the recently proclaimed mayor of Cockington, is no longer allowed to visit his local pub. Council enforcement officers told the pub they would need planning permission to reclassify their pub garden to become official grazing land if Patrick wanted to continue at pasture there. Wow. Harry Mounts alongside me. We've got a minute, Harry. What do you want to talk about? Anything will do.
Well, that Patrick story was I thought, very upsetting, that it seems extraordinary that you have to apply for a different licence for a pub garden from a pasture. I mean, I imagine horses aren't that fussy, or ponies aren't that fussy about what grass they'll eat. It seemed very unfair on poor Patrick and on the punters in the pub then.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably true. We've got 30 seconds left on the more serious matter of independence.
Yeah.
Did Michelle Ballantyne Michael Blackley from the Daily Mail in Scotland have a point when he said that Sturgeon's peak has passed?
I think it has, and you're getting more and more reports about actually the government not being very effective in Scotland. But at the same time, I thought Michelle was right. During the 2014 referendum, the more clever unionists argued, we'd love you to stay, we'd hate it if you left, but we love you. And I think better to argue from affection rather than attack the SNP with aggression.
Totally agree. Make the positive case for us being together. Harry, thanks very much indeed. More news coming up at 5.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GBNews.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hi there, welcome to Brazier. Coming up live at 5 for you. Are we being ripped off by big oil as the typical household energy bill heads towards £3,600 a year this winter? Energy giant BP today reported its biggest quarterly profit for 14 years. The energy firms, including Shell, argue they're already paying billions in extra taxes and financing your pension funds. So are we right to be miffed at such bumper profits? Also this hour, at a Tory leadership hustings event in Exeter last night, candidate Liz Truss wasn't afraid to speak out. She claimed we should ignore the Scottish First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, pledged to crack down on public sector pay, and in an announcement she today backtracked on that one. She also took a strong stance on COVID.
Can I just ask you if you would ever authorise another lockdown?
No, I wouldn't.
We've got reaction for you. The political editor at the Sunday Mirror, Nigel Nelson, and the former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie. And find out why traditional British cider makers are taking a stand for better protection of their beverage. With me for the next hour, the editor of The Oldie, Harry Mount. But first, the latest news headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. Just after 5 o'clock, the latest top story today. Archie Battersby's parents have lost their Supreme Court bid to block the withdrawal of his life support treatment. The 12-year-old's family had issued an urgent appeal following a midday deadline on withdrawing his care. Archie was found unconscious after an accident at his home in April and was declared brainstem dead by doctors. Also in the news today, a man who was arrested carrying a crossbow in the grounds of Windsor Castle has been charged under the Treason Act. Police say Jaswant Singh Chail from Southampton is accused of intending to injure or alarm the Queen. The 20-year-old was intercepted on Christmas Day last year. He'll appear in court later this month. Tory leadership candidate Liz Truss has abandoned a proposed policy to slash public sector pay for workers outside London. At the hustings event in Exeter last night, where she appeared alongside her opponent Rishi Sunak, she claimed the plan would save nearly £9 billion annually. Labour and Conservative MPs have criticised the move, though, saying the policy would level down the country. And as you've been hearing, BP has reported a profit of nearly £7 billion for the second quarter, its biggest in 14 years. That's as UK households are hit by rising oil and gas prices, with inflation at its highest in 40 years. A consultancy firm has warned energy bills could reach more than £3,600 this winter. That's hundreds of pounds more than previously expected for England, Wales and Scotland. And British Airways has suspended the sale of short-haul flights from Heathrow for at least a week. The airline has temporarily halted ticket sales for domestic and European services, saying it was in response to Heathrow Airport's request to limit new bookings. Last month, Heathrow announced a limit of 100,000 passengers per day until mid-September. And Nancy Pelosi has become the first US House Speaker to visit Taiwan for a quarter of a century. After landing, she had a clear message for China, saying Washington's commitment to Taiwan's democracy was more important than ever. She made the trip to the island despite a warning from the Chinese president that it would undermine relations. Russia backed China, describing the visit as provocative, saying they and China oppose the independence of Taiwan.
On Saturday, at my direction, the United States successfully concluded an airstrike in Kabul, Afghanistan, that killed the emir of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now, justice has been delivered, and this terrorist leader is no more.
Well, that was Joe Biden talking about the assassination by the Americans of a senior al-Qaeda leader in Afghanistan. Former defence advisor to President Bush, Jonil Jaffer, told GB News the airstrike was a huge win for the White House and the world.
To be sure, al-Qaeda will try to regroup and will appoint a new leader, probably Sirajuddin Haqqani, a member of the Afghan government and the former head of the Haqqani network. But al-Qaeda, for now at least, is been worn down. They will come back, though, and the key is to keep the pressure on them, both in the United States to prevent attacks in the United States, but also against our allies in the UK and Europe.
And an arrest warrant has been issued for the older brother of the Manchester Arena bomber after he didn't turn up to give evidence at the public inquiry into the 2017 attack. Ismail Abedi, who fled the UK last summer, failed to attend the hearing at Manchester Magistrates Court today. Last month, the 29-year-old was found guilty in his absence of failing to comply with a notice which compelled him to cooperate with the inquiry. Almost 700 migrants crossed the English Channel today, a daily record for this year so far. Latest figures from the Ministry of Defence showed 696 individuals made the journey in 14 boats today. Large groups of migrants, including young children, were being seen brought ashore in Ramsgate before leaving the Kent port on buses. You're up to date on GB News. More news as it happens. Now back to Brazier.
Hi. Households are today being told their energy bills could rise to almost £4,000 this winter. News they've received just hours before the energy giant BP announced its biggest quarterly profits for 14 years. Underlying profits, they hit £6.9 billion, more than triple the amount it made BP at the same time last year. Well, last week, Shell, the other one, also announced bumper profits, nearly £10 billion. Some campaign groups calling on the government to introduce a tougher windfall tax, another windfall tax on the profits of big oil and gas, while others are pointing out the firms pay billions in tax already, whilst helping our pension funds stay solvent. And though this year the companies may have done well, really well, other years they lose money. That's the nature of oil and gas exploration. It's hit and miss. Let's turn to the former CEO of Energy UK, Angela Knight, who joins us now. Angela Knight, welcome to you. Just give us a sense, I tried to run it all together there, but just give us a sense of what proportion of profits these companies are already paying in tax and what taxes they pay.
Well, they pay tax to the UK on what they on the oil and gas that they drill in the UK, because these are international companies, you see. So they are pulling out oil and gas all around the world, and they're paying tax all around the world. Now, here in the UK, that part for which we tax them, the tax right now is 40% on their profit, which is about twice what any other company pays. But it's now gone up to 65% from now on of their profit, which is about 3 times what any other company pays. So that's a very big additional tax placed on the likes of BP, Shell, and indeed Centrica. But as I say, these are international companies. They're not just local. And what's more, they're making their money on the upstream part, the drilling, the pulling that gas and electricity out and trading it on the wholesale market. It's not money that they're making on charging you and me more than they should for supplying us with gas and electricity. Shell and BP are not a supplier to ourselves.
Are they victims to some degree of fashionable prejudice in the sense that, for instance, other industries can enjoy bumper profits for reasons that have nothing to do necessarily with the business choices they've made? The obvious one right now would be, Big Pharma. But there isn't that clamour for Big Pharma to be whacked with punitive taxes because they're seen as sort of cuddly and benign for the most part.
Well, I think they're thought of as cuddly and benign right now because they did such a wonderful job in creating vaccines and pills, which has meant that we've been so successful in fighting against COVID. But they're not always thought of as cuddly and friendly. I think now one of the real reasons that there is this concern about the big companies like BP and like Shell is because people think that, first of all this money is made here in the UK, and secondly, that somehow we are personally paying more in order that they make the profit. So where I think one of their biggest mistakes is they haven't put out somebody to explain and talk about it, and not just on results day, but all the way through. Because, it is a complicated issue. It's very easy to connect up two parts of a jigsaw, but actually they're not the parts that ought to be connected. And at the same time as they're making profits, they're able to invest it in the future, which is predominantly wind farms, and hopefully they'll also be engaged in small nuclear. And if they don't make those profits, they can't invest. And if they don't pay a dividend, it doesn't go into our pension funds. So, it is not a straightforward equation, but the way it is often presented, it's as if it was a straightforward equation.
Yeah. And as you say, we want companies like BP to go beyond petroleum, don't we? And if that involves getting involved in nuclear and certainly in wind farms and all the rest of it, then all power to them. It's a bit media navel-gazing, but on the point you make that they should have been putting people up to explain their complicated argument, is that just a decision of high-ups? Why do you think they've taken it?
Well, I don't really know because I can't see inside their heads, but it is pretty common that where a company knows it's going to be hit for six by in the way that it is interviewed and the questions that it's asked, that they will debate as to, do I want to go out there and be shot, or do I just hide and let it all wash through because whatever I say is still going to be as bad. And so I can understand.
Bunker, they cross their fingers and hope there's a bigger story around.
Yeah, I can understand the natural inclination to go and hide, but the reality is you can't explain everything in a 30-second soundbite or a few characters on Twitter. And if you don't explain your story yourself, then there's a very big chance that somebody will put two things together which don't match and you'll be in a worse situation. Perhaps one last thing, if I may say briefly. I think another thing that they could do is they could contribute either themselves into a charitable fund or into one of the other charitable funds that are available, which will help people by making grants who are on the poorest end of society. And anything like that at least is directly giving back, even though it may not be, they're not a supplier. They are actually doing a little bit more than they have to. And I think, again, this is one of the situations where you do have to do a little bit more than you have to if you're a company making very large profits.
Angela Knight, appreciate your time and your expertise. Thanks very much indeed. Harry Mount is alongside me this hour. One thing that the people that Angela Knight's suggesting ought to be taken to the airwaves today could say, and I think you made the point in the last hour, is if it's not coming from BP, this lovely oil and gas, you'll need to look east to Gazprom and the big Russian providers and commodities brokers and all the rest of it. And that's not a great idea.
No, and Putin is still making an absolute fortune from his oil and gas. And it's not BP or Shell's fault that oil prices are so high. It's largely his fault for invading Ukraine. I think it is unfair. They've been held up as the evil poster boy of capitalism, haven't they, the oil companies? No one suggests that if Sainsbury's is something to make a lot of money through selling food, just as important to us as energy, if not more so, that they should have a windfall tax. I think they have been unfairly treated.
And I think that's why Angela's wrong when she says that they ought to go in for some heavy-duty PR and set up a special fund for the poor. These companies already do loads of philanthropic stuff. And it just feeds that narrative that somehow we're making these profits guiltily. Yeah, and I think that's corrosive.
Yeah, exactly. The BP chief did blunder, didn't he, just before the windfall tax was imposed, when he said if there was one, which there now has been one, it would make no difference to his plans. Well, that was walking into an open trap. What the government could do, rather than impose yet another windfall tax, is cut the tax on petrol, which is an incredibly high proportion of the...
45p out of a pound. Yeah. We're blaming the wrong people, guys. It's the tax man, not big oil, that should get it. Harry, thanks very much indeed. Last night, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss went head-to-head again, this time in Exeter, second round of a dozen hustings as they tried to convince Conservative members why they ought to be the next leader of the Tory party and ultimately our next Prime Minister. Liz Truss didn't hold back, claiming she wanted to introduce, there she was very briefly, we've seen a lot of her, to introduce regional pay boards in a bid to save a potential £8.8 billion. But there was a subsequent backlash from several senior Tories. She's since backtracked on her pledge. Well, in a statement, Liz Truss's team have now said current levels of public sector pay will absolutely be maintained. Anything to suggest otherwise is simply wrong. She also got the backing of the former leadership hopeful, one-time front-runner, wasn't she, Penny Mordaunt. And this is what part of what she had to say.
Who is going to hold seats and win back councils? And who most embodies the vision and values the British public had in their heads and their hearts when they voted in 2016 and 2019? At the start of this final phase of the contest, I didn't know the answer to those questions, but I've seen enough to know who the person I'm going to put my faith in is. And that is Liz Truss.
Well, let's turn to the political editor at the Sunday Mirror and Sunday People. That's Nigel Nelson, and the former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie. Gentlemen, welcome both. Kelvin, if I can start with you. I was particularly struck by this lockdown comment from Liz Truss. I thought it was a daft thing to say, bordering on the doonally. I'm no fan, as many of us aren't, of lockdowns. For me, they went on for too long, were too hard. But who can say what's round the corner? A new variant, incredibly virulent, just takes off the nippers and kids, airborne. Who knows? You can't rule out all lockdowns.
Well, I'm not sure she was ruling out all lockdowns. What she was basically saying was that if we had the same circumstances with COVID again, with what we know now, then we wouldn't be locking down so often and with such joy. And I do agree with her about that. So I agree with her about that. I agree with her about giving a whack to Nicola Sturgeon, which I would have thought was just about hurry home her opportunity to become Prime Minister. I mean, English Conservatives, signed up Conservatives, dislike Miss Sturgeon with a visceral dislike. And I think, and by the way, I agree with her on that. I am actually a Rishi guy myself, but she had a couple of things there. That one where she did the U-turn on showed that she was running off at the lip. A ludicrous thing to say, not least of all because actually, thanks to tech, what we're all using now, right? Everybody can do their jobs anywhere. And the idea that you're a geography teacher in Newcastle, it's just as important to your 30 kids in that class as a geography teacher in, for instance, South London. And you get a waiting allowance for that. She didn't think that through. I have no idea who advised her on that. And that was, to my mind, a blunder. And it's that kind of mistake which I fear may lead, well, when I say I fear, I'm in favour of it. I'm in favour of Rishi, right? I think it may damage her when it comes to putting a cross by her name.
And Nigel, just on that, in quotes, blunder, Kelvin says it was off the lip, from the hip. In a sense, it wasn't. I mean, she wasn't answering, she may have been answering a question, but it wasn't on the hoof. She had time to think about those numbers, but the numbers were still wrong.
Yeah, the numbers were wrong. And certainly she did have time. I mean, she put a press release out before that to actually announce the policy. And the policy looked quite thought through. And what it said was that public sector workers, sometime down the road in the future, will be subject to lower pay in the North and Midlands than they would be in London and the South East. So it's more than just a shooting from the lip. It was a huge error. She was talking about £8.8 billion worth of savings without explaining where those savings would come from. But quite clearly, they couldn't come from the civil service because the pay bill there is only about £9 billion anyway. So it was a ridiculous thing to do. Yesterday, I would have said that this race was Liz Truss's to lose. If I come to think of it, I did say that on GBNews. Now I think that the important thing is if she was going to win, she mustn't implode. She mustn't make stupid mistakes. This is imploding. This is a stupid mistake.
Kelvin, more broadly on the idea that she's looking at ways of reducing public spending. I'm guessing you'd like many of the Tory members, I'm sure, like the idea that she's talking about. Being able to cut taxes. There are only so many ways you can cut taxes. You cut spending, you borrow more, you grow the economy. And everybody just cites the last two as if that's easy. And it's not. The hard thing to do is to cut spending, as Margaret Thatcher showed us. But it's a way of creating a direct link between tax cuts and what's coming into the coffers.
Yes, well, I mean, as Tony Blair said, he said the hardest word to use in politics is no. Because there's a queue of people outside number 10 with various begging bowls representing various charities and various people whose life has not gone. They don't all drive Maseratis and live in huge houses in Cobham in Surrey. And I'm afraid you just got to turn them away. So we haven't got the money. And by the way, we haven't got the money to give everybody a huge 10% pay hike. And so lots of people are going to go on strike. And I think one of the issues about going on strike right now is that actually I can see the strike weapon actually being blunted. As having been through COVID, having seen tens of thousands of people dying, having everybody thinking the end of the world was coming, my bin men have gone on strike. I say, good luck to you, mate. Let's see where you are in 6 months' time. So I think a lot of things are changing right now, and that's why I want a Rishi and not a Liz.
You see, Nigel Nelson, I don't want you to speak for Kelvin, obviously, but I would have thought his deductive logic takes you to Liz Truss, not Rishi Sunak, because it feels like Liz Truss is more likely to pick a Thatcher-style fight with the unions than Rishi Sunak.
Yes, you might be when it comes to the unions, but we're also talking about reckless tax cuts at a time when inflation is running rampant. So what Rishi Sunak is saying is that now is not the right time to pump even more money into the economy, which will just fuel more inflation. However, then again, Rishi Sunak also seems to be making policy up on the hoof, that the idea that you can have a 4p tax cut by 2028 based on economic growth seems to me as much pie in the sky as ruling out lockdowns. You don't know what's round the corner. He may have figures now that say that growth will actually allow him to pay for a tax cut like that. But then if we'd followed Bank of England figures from last year, inflation will be about 2% now. So you just can't make those predictions so far in advance.
Kelvin Mackenzie, why are you for Rishi?
Right. Well, I don't like agreeing with the Labour supporter, but unfortunately, in this case, I have to. I hated him saying that he was going to reduce income tax, by about 2098. After all, in the last 3 years, we've had COVID, which has killed tens of thousands, and we've had a war in Eastern Europe, which has sent the price of gas up by 300-400%. I mean, he doesn't know what the future holds. I don't know, and honestly, even the shareholders of GBNews don't know. So it's ridiculous. However, I don't like Liz Truss for saying that she's going to cut taxation. I hate paying taxes. I hate HMRC. They dislike me intensely. But at the end of the day, we have nothing in the coffers right now. And on that basis, the idea that we've said we've got nothing, the cupboard is bare, and what we're going to do is take out another 30 billion strikes me as completely mad. and we're going to go through some tough times. I mean, if people think things are tough now, wait until you get to a foggy day in November and then work out what life looks like. We've got tough times ahead, and I just think that Rishi at least knows what a pound note looks like, and I suspect that Liz Truss doesn't. And I don't like the idea of her parents being left-wing academics either.
Oh, you can't heap the sins of the parents on the
Yeah,
child.
no, I'm holding it against her. She was a Lib Dem, she was a Remainer. How on earth can she be a Conservative leader? We've gone mad.
Kelvin Mackenzie and Nigel Nelson, thanks both very much indeed. Harry Mount's alongside me. We'll take your pick.
Well, I think a really interesting thing is how decisive Tory members are and how quickly they make their decisions. I was at a party a couple of weeks ago. A lot of Tory members were there. It was before they got down to the final two, and they'd already chosen who they wanted to back. And I didn't think any of them were ever going to change their minds. I'd have thought there's I don't know, but a very small percentage of swing voters between Rishi and Liz. We just know Kelvin's a very, very strong Rishi man. I'd have thought those decisions have largely been made, and I'd have thought largely for Liz.
Kelvin Mackenzie is undeniably wrong about the parents' sins being heaped on the daughter. He's got a point, surely, when he talks about the winter of discontent that's looming. If you look, we're not going to be Germany. We only get 5% of our gas, I think it is, from Russia, as opposed to 40% of Germany's gas from Russia. But there's trouble ahead with keeping the lights on and keeping the
I don't know, when you turn your heating on, Colin, with me, it's normally sometime in October. Now, obviously, the bills are going to soar then. Yeah, Kelvin's quite right then.
Yeah. Stock up on firewood, guys. Harry, thanks very much indeed. You are with Colin Brazier. This is GB News on TV, online and on digital radio. Coming up, rural crime has shot up 40% this year. It costs farmers in the UK an estimated £40+ million. We'll be joined by one farmer in Norfolk who's had some bitter first-hand experience of the effect crime can have on livelihoods there. Back in a tick.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Coming up on The Mark Steyn Show, as Liz Truss promises no more lockdowns if she comes into power, we'll be asking Toby Young of The Daily Sceptic if he believes she's ready to turn her back on the pandemic as Prime Minister. Monkeypox mania marches on, but Natalie Winters won't be leaving any stones unturned following a WHO meeting about the vaccine. Plus, Eva Vladingerbroek is back to shine a light on digital IDs after the government in Greece starts rolling them out to its population. All that and more on The Mark Steyn Show tonight at 8 o'clock.
Very briefly, story from our friends at the Press Association who write this. A snorkeler has suffered a suspected shark attack in what they described as a, quote, very scary incident off the coast of Cornwall. The swimmer suffered a bite to the leg and needed help from Her Majesty's Coast Guard and ambulance crews following the encounter near Penzance. This was on Thursday. The victim was reportedly bitten by a blue shark while on a snorkelling trip. Let's talk about rural crime. Rural crime has shot up by 40% amid the cost of living crisis, with vehicles like Land Rover Defenders top targets for thieves. After 2 years of falling crime during the pandemic, I think there's quite a lot of fly tipping going on there, wasn't there? The cost of rural theft has rocketed to £40 million a year. A report from the insurer NFU Mutual found that costs for the first quarter of this year were 40% higher than the same period last year. Let's turn to one farmer, Tim Papworth, who joins us now. Tim, welcome to you. I was reading a story recently about a combine that was nicked, but it still had the GPS on, and they saw that it had popped up somewhere in Eastern Europe. These things are stolen to order sometimes.
Yes, afternoon, Colin. Combine GPSs, we lost ours 2 or 3 years ago now. Unfortunately, they are stolen to order, and they're very expensive bits of kit that take a lot of replacing, and they're not easy to replace either with what's the war going on in Russia and Ukraine. That's meant that a lot of our supplies have gone dried up, and we haven't got those parts available anymore, unfortunately.
Sometimes it's theft to order, as you say. Sometimes it's just mindless vandalism. I know you've had a problem with people setting fire to bales of hay or straw. I'm not sure which, but big bales.
We've had that in the past. We had bales of straw stacked on the side of the fields, ready to be carted down the road and loaded up onto lorries. And the mindless vandals decided to set light to them. We had 2 cases of that, and they've great to the police, and great to all the credit to the police. To be honest with you, they managed to catch them, and they've actually been through the court system now. I don't know whether they're in prison or whether they've been fined or what the end of it was, but they have actually been caught, and that stopped that, hopefully.
Tim, do you have problems where you are with things like hair coursing? Because I've heard farmers moaning before about people gaining a legal entry to their land and then hair coursing and filming the whole thing, and then it's recorded and played back in a club, and people bet on it and that sort of thing, and it can get very confrontational. Is that a problem in your part of the world, and if so, do the police respond?
Not so much this part of the world. I'm sort of really in the depths of Norfolk here near Cromer, and it's a long way for those type of people to come and commit that sort of crime. That's more of a Cambridgeshire-based activity. For them to come to rural North Norfolk would be a long stretch, and obviously when you come here, 3/4 of the area is the sea. So getting out in a hurry with police chasing you is not such a good thing for them to be able to do. So actually, we don't suffer too badly from hair coursing here.
No, Lincolnshire's particularly badly hit, isn't it, as well? The big problem you've got, and it's a problem for all farmers, is that you get lulled into a false sense of security to some degree, don't you? It's by necessity and definition pretty isolated, and you want to access the equipment. You want to be able to jump on the quad bike without unchaining it, for instance. But that does present opportunities for thieves.
Yeah, the most difficult one is actually when you're busy in harvest. Actually, you don't want to move your combine back to the farmyard and put it in the shed and lock it up every night, because we want to be back in that field the next day. So you tend to leave your machinery in the field, so it's there ready for the next day. You go the next day and find that someone's taken the diesel out of it, someone's taken the sat nav of it, but we don't want to necessarily move it back late at night. Sort of sometimes that's early hours, sort of 1 o'clock in the morning, you finish combine, you don't always want to take it back to the farm, which could be miles away. That's the most difficult one.
Yeah, I'm sure the red diesel's pretty attractive because it's doubled in price in a year, hasn't it? Tim, how's the harvest going?
Harvest going very, very well, thank you, Colin. Yes, we've done our oilseed rape. We're well on with our winter wheat, and winter barley is done, and we're just starting some spring barley today. But yields are pretty good considering the dry summer we've had. We've been very lucky.
Yeah, it's not quite been declared a drought yet, but there's not been much rain around, that's for sure. But maybe that's not a terrible thing right now. Tim, thanks very much indeed for your time. Thanks a lot. Coming up, we're going to discuss the Foreign Secretary and the Tory leadership hopeful's strong stance on the possibility of another lockdown.
Can I just ask you if you would ever authorise another lockdown?
No, I wouldn't.
Under any circumstances? Has Liz Truss backed herself into a corner by outright claiming she'd be against any more lockdowns? First, the latest news headlines with Polly.
Colin, thank you. The top stories. Archie Battersby's parents have lost their Supreme Court appeal, which means the 12-year-old will be taken off life support. Archie has been in a coma since April and has been declared brain dead by doctors. 3 judges refused to postpone the withdrawal of treatment and also refused permission to appeal against their ruling. A man who was arrested carrying a crossbow in the grounds of Windsor Castle on Christmas Day has been charged under the Treason Act. Police say 20-year-old Jaswant Singh Chahil from Southampton is accused of intending to injure or alarm the Queen. And as you've been hearing, Tory leadership candidate Liz Truss has abandoned a proposed policy to slash public sector pay for workers outside London. At a hustings event in Exeter last evening, she said the plan could save nearly £9 billion annually. But Labour and senior Conservatives have criticised the move, saying it would level down the country. And BP's reported a profit of nearly £7 billion in the second quarter. That's the highest in 14 years. That at the same time as UK households are hit by rising oil and gas prices, with inflation at its highest point in 40 years. A consultancy firm has warned energy bills could reach more than £3,600 per household this winter. And British Airways has suspended the sale of short-haul flights from Heathrow for at least a week. The move affects domestic and European services, with the airline saying it's in response to Heathrow's request to limit new bookings. Last month, the airport announced a daily limit of 100,000 passengers until mid-September. That's it. You're up to date on TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. You're with GB News.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
And a brief look at how the markets are going for you. The pound will buy you $1.221 US and 1.198 euros. The price of gold currently standing at £1,453.31 an ounce.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News, investments that matter.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation. We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Was it wise for the woman, perhaps on current polling destined to be our next Prime Minister, to be quite so rude about Nicola Sturgeon last night in those hustings in Exeter? Liz Truss described Nicola Sturgeon as an attention seeker. Emails. Gordon says Truss is quite right. Sturgeon and the SNP have been ignoring the will of the Scottish electorate since 2014 and the once-in-a-lifetime referendum. Dam says, I've lost count at how many times Sturgeon's been offensive, rude and insulting to Boris and many other Conservatives. Always antagonistic language with one broken record to answer everything. We want independence. Vote yawn. Truss is completely right to start firing off some comments on how she will deal with Sturgeon. Sian says very undiplomatic and contrived of Truss. She's trying to appeal to the husting members like a family gossiping about a neighbour. Comedian-like, but not funny. And Eileen says Sturgeon does not speak for all Scots. She is definitely an attention seeker and should not be given the platform she has. I'll debate this hour. Liz Truss, afraid we're sticking with Liz Truss, yesterday ruling out ever authorising another lockdown if she were to become Prime Minister. Here's what she said, part of what she said at those leadership hustings.
Can I just ask you if you would ever authorise another lockdown?
No. No, I wouldn't.
Would you authorise, you probably couldn't hear the question, would you authorise another lockdown? No, she said. Is she right to rule out future lockdowns? We're joined by Angus Dalgleish, Professor of Oncology at St George's Hospital Medical School, and taking perhaps a contrary view, certainly, the editor of the Oldie, Harry Mount, here in the studio. Angus Dalgleish, was this wise, given that you don't know what kind of variant's round the corner?
Well, you're right. We don't know what variant is around the corner, but relative to the sort of risk that we were exposed to, and indeed we have been expecting, we've been expecting a pandemic to come out of the Far East, particularly China, for a long time. I think that she's right that anything similar to this, that's an airborne pathogen, that there is no justification at all for a lockdown. And I think that what a lot of people have got very confused about is that there's a distinction between lockdown and quarantine. Now, if we had some much worse virus or pathogen come into the community and it was clearly going to be more fatal, say, for example, like Ebola, then you really do want to prevent that getting into the population, but you do that by quarantine. You don't lock down the population. The people who are exposed or populations where the incidence is high, you prevent them coming into the country, etc. And I feel very strongly we missed that opportunity, and I think the WHO had an awful lot to explain about this, that when we knew that there was an outbreak in Wuhan and they were locking down, that we were allowing planes every day from Wuhan and around China to land at Heathrow. So, I mean, why would you do that? And then in the middle, while that's going on, before you stop those flights, you have a lockdown in London. The whole of the UK. So that is my point, that anything worse than what we've experienced should be managed by effective quarantine of where it is, not locking down the population. From that point of view, I think she's right.
Harry Mount, was it not welcome, I mean, just parking all that on one level, was it not welcome that at the very least, the most important political story of the last 2 years, COVID, was actually the subject of a question? I mean, it's not cropped up very often in these hustings or the debates, and we've got a pretty clear answer on an important topic.
Yes, but I do think she was misguided. She should have put in the proviso of saying, if we were in the same circumstances we were in for those terrible almost 2 years, then she wouldn't impose a lockdown. And I'd agree with her on that. And to be fair to the government at the time, We'd had nothing like this in our lifetimes, had we? We were in shock. We were terrified. And then we've also had the great magic weapon of the vaccine. So I'd hope if you had the same circumstances again, I'd agree with Liz Truss, you shouldn't have another lockdown. You certainly shouldn't have that crazy behaviour which people did in fear and shock of policemen telling old people to get up from park benches or people informing on their neighbours. So I think she should have just said, within the same circumstances, let's have a lockdown. And I think it's been shown Sweden, that had far less severe impositions, had a much lower death rate.
Yeah, I mean, Professor, no fans of lockdown in this studio, and we've talked many times about the ruinous impact of lockdown on mental health, education, your particular area of expertise in oncology, and none of that was factored in with the lockdowns. But the question is specific on what Liz Truss said. I mean, and you're the expert here. Could there not be at some future time a particularly virulent variant which has very high lethality? And let's say, for example, rather than targeting is the wrong word, being particularly bad for old people, it's particularly bad for young people. It has to be a tool kept in the armoury, not dismissed as something that can never happen under any circumstances.
Well, there are the circumstances which you might want to revisit it, and I think it would be very, very limiting, would be the scenario, which has happened with a flu variant before, is where the younger people get infected and are more at risk of dying as opposed to the old people. Certainly, one of these classical respiratory viruses that we've just gone through this pandemic for, I would say you never ever lock down for anything like that again, unless you were faced with this thing that was killing younger people. But it would not be a mass lockdown. It would be what I would call a kind of quarantine effect. And there is a massive difference, which I think has been totally overlooked. And I would go back and really stress the thing that we had all these predictions that lockdown would save this, that and the other. In fact, the big papers looking at it reckon in the UK we saved about 200 lives from lockdown. I mean, it's absolutely a minimal number compared to the number of people who die every day. And yet the number of people who are dying now and will die for the next 10 years is absolutely going to be enormous, dwarfing. I think lockdown was the biggest mistake made, and I'm not doing it in retrospect. I said it at the time. I was totally supportive of Tenga's Andreas Tegnell, who was the Swedish chief medical officer, said no, no, no. And all my colleagues disagreed with him. And what I never heard is, we've done the modelling, the worst scenario, the worst number of people killed, but was there ever the modelling of the knock-on effect if you do the lockdown? What's going to happen down the line? That was never done, and I think that was a disaster that was never done. And I think Angus has had the vision and foresight to realise that, and Sweden has a better outcome. And one sentence says it all: not a single child lost a day's schooling in Sweden. Whereas we're going to pay for the lockdown knock-on effect of damaged schooling, education, personal development. I mean, it is awful. And even in my own circle, a club I go to, we've had 2 suicides from lockdown. It wasn't during lockdown, but in the case I knew well, it was the person committed suicide because he behaved himself so well in lockdown. It was the realisation that it was a complete waste of time, sent him into a terrible depression. And I mean, how many of these cases are going to go on and on? Because I think it will. And I hope never, ever again, unless there's unbelievable, exceptional circumstances. And that would be after quarantine.
And you know better than most of us, don't you, Professor, that those mental health crises leading to something as drastic as suicide won't be recorded as a COVID death. And of course, in a sense, they ought to be. Professor, thanks so much for your expertise as ever, and Harry Mount here in the studio. Thanks both. A topic which we will revisit. Name the largest producer of cider in Europe. That's us. Britain, proud tradition of making some of the finest drinks available at the pub tap and elsewhere. British cider makers say their reputation, however, is being damaged by the proliferation of cheap, substandard alternatives. I was always told at journalism school you can only have one alternative, Harry. That's true, isn't it? Anyway, there we go. Cheap, substandard alternatives. And they're calling for their produce to be given protected status, like champagne. The founder of Lawrence's Cider is John Lawrence, who joins us from Somerset. Hi to you, John Lawrence. Tell us about your cider.
Hello.
Hi, John. Tell us about your cider.
Oh, well, it's made from 100% British English cider apples that I harvest personally, and I go to the same orchard every year. It's about a 7-8 acre orchard, and the farmer gives me a hand, and together we pick up to about 7 tons from his orchard every year, which I bring home and process them, press them, wash them, press them, and then get the extracted juice, put it into barrels, and the fermentation starts. And then after 6 months, hopefully, cross fingers, it's all good to drink. So there's no additives, well, apart from one, but there's no water. It's 100% juice, and it's my customers seem to love it. So there you go.
And in terms of this idea of special recognition, when we think of special recognition when it comes to food and drink, for some people, you'll correct us because you know, that harks back to the days of Brussels. And that if you made a particular type of cheese or cured meat, let's say, from a certain part of Europe, you could apply for a special status, so only you could call it X. Is that what we're talking about here?
I believe so. There is a petition that's going to Parliament to try to get special recognition for cider. It's because there are this cider out there it's called cider, and it can be called cider even though it's only got about 30% juice, apple juice in it. And when I say apple juice, I use the term very lightly because a lot of that is concentrate, and where that comes from, who knows? There's chemicals and all sorts of water. And it can be very high alcoholic content. How they get it that high, it's probably added sugar. And it gives cider a bit of a bad name because it can be bought cheaply in supermarkets. And the customer, when they see cider, they want to know what they're getting. And, you know, if they knew that they were getting like 30% of it was juice and the rest was chemicals and water and whatever, I'm sure they wouldn't be happy. You know, if you tell somebody that it's 100% juice, it's cider, it ought to have some sort of regulation. That I think they're trying to get the percentage of apple in this petition, percentage of apple juice increased from 30 to 50%. That would make a difference, but personally, I'd like to see all cider 100% cider.
Yeah, and you obviously and the people you serve can tell the difference between the pure apple cider and the adulterated stuff that's got concentrates in. But I'm just wondering.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but
we're trying to educate people all the time.
Yeah, I'm not sure my teenagers who tuck into the Strongbow have that same appreciation. You know, they just want the effects.
Yes, yeah, I know. Yeah, it's yeah. Yeah, well, it's full of antioxidants as well. 100% juice, and it's very beneficial. Apparently, very beneficial to you, similar to wine. So.
John Lawrence,
but I'm not sure all the chemicals in the...
You won't be the first maker of a particular type of alcohol to come on this programme saying it's very good for you. I'm sure it is. John Lawrence, very nice to talk to you. John is the founder of the eponymous Lawrence's Cider. Thanks very much indeed. And we'll talk to Harry Mount about what that story means to him shortly. First this, a snorkeler has suffered a suspected shark attack in what they described as a, quote, very scary incident. Not that remarkable globally, but you need to know that was off the coast of Cornwall. The swimmer suffered a bite to the... Before we get complaints from the Cornwall Tourist Board, it wasn't that shark. This is an illustrative... a series of illustrations of sharks. Wow. The swimmer, in this instance, suffered a bite to the leg. and needed help from HM Coast Guard and ambulance crews following the encounter near Penzance on Thursday. I shouldn't be giggling, it's a very serious story. The victim was reportedly bitten by a blue shark on this snorkelling trip. The UK-based charity The Shark Trust says there have been no unprovoked shark bites in British waters since 1847, when records began. Harry Mount's alongside me. You've got, as editor of The Oldie, many readers with long memories. Not 1847 necessarily. This was a minor shark attack, but the words shark and attack, for those of us who go swimming in Cornwall, are enough to scare you a bit.
Yeah, no, it's very scary, but I hope there's not going to be a Jaws-style response with people leaping out of the water. I thought it's highly unlikely there'd be another. I used to be the New York correspondent of the Daily Telegraph, and my beat covered Florida, where there were quite often shark attacks, but my editor there would say if there was one attack, that meant nothing. You needed three close together to produce a so-called trend, and they're obviously much more ferocious there in Florida. So I'd have thought the people in Cornwall can swim perfectly safe.
It's safe to go back in the water?
I'd say so, yeah.
Well, thanks very much indeed. We'll talk to you about cider yet. In the meantime, Michelle Dewberry is on hand to tell you and us what's coming up on her show. Michelle.
Hello, yes. We'll be looking at the goings-on from Exeter last night. Nicola Sturgeon, should she simply be ignored? I've heard you talking about that, and I know it's got the viewers talking as well. We'll be looking more at that, and some of the other policies that Liz Truss was proposing and flirting, one of which, by the way, she's U-turned on already. I also want to look at the travel chaos. Is bringing in the army the answer to that conundrum? Because let's face it, it's a mess pretty much the whole way through at the moment, isn't it? And I want to ask, are workplaces going soft? All about the youngsters, Colin. That's you and I. We're not affected by that. But our workplace is just bending, going a bit too soft to accommodate the young.
Interesting, as always. Michelle, thanks very much indeed. Just time for a few emails. Alan says, we're back on Liz Truss. Truss is right. There was no need for the last lockdown. There's definitely no need to have another. If you're just tuning in, Liz Truss suggested that she would not have another lockdown. Alan says, you quarantine those that are ill. Healthy people that will not be affected should just carry on. Nick says, Liz Truss is definitely right to say no to lockdown because we now know the cost of lockdowns. Barbara, as late as 2016, Liz Truss was supporting the EU. People can change their minds when they become enlightened, but that she accepted the status quo at the time says a lot about her. She didn't get or care about why people were voting to leave. I'll just put that point to Harry Mount. Who would have thought, a couple of years ago even, that you would have a Remainer, self-declared Remainer, ahead of a Leaver in the race to be the next Prime Minister and leader of the Tory party?
It is remarkable. I remember those Tory candidate elections of about 15 years ago when it was always clear that the Eurosceptic, whether it was Ian Duncan Smith or Michael Howard, would beat the Housewives' favourites like Ken Clarke and Michael Portillo because they were Europhiles. It's interesting that has changed. I think that's quite healthy because only 6 years after the referendum, it shows that it isn't dominating the debate. It has been until recently.
Harry Mount, thanks very much indeed. Much more news coming up. Stand by for Michelle.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. A breezy and cloudy day for many of us, but it is also warm. It's humid out there because our air is coming up from the southwest, and although low pressure is in charge, that low sitting to the northwest of the UK, and it is bringing some weather fronts, well, the heavier rain has now moved away, and so mostly it's just cloud and some light outbreaks of rain, predominantly over parts of Wales, especially hills and coasts, northern England as well as we head into the evening, and then increasingly parts of southwest England will turn damp. There'll be showers for Scotland and Northern Ireland and some more prolonged rain coming into the northwest of Scotland for a time, but staying dry in the southeast and wherever you are. It is going to be a warm night, temperatures holding up in the mid to high teens. So a muggy night and another warm start to the day on Wednesday. A lot of cloud once again, some rain for a time in the southwest as well as South Wales. Now that turns to showers as it pushes into the Midlands, central southern England. Stays dry in the far southeast. Skies brighten across the southern half of the UK. Showers continue for Scotland, Northern Ireland and northern England. A fresher feel, I think, in the north and the west, but still relatively humid with temperatures up to 28 or 29 Celsius in the southeast. The cloud disappears across southern parts of the country into Wednesday evening. Further showers for a time, mainly around coasts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. And then another relatively warm night with that humid air still with us to some extent, but not quite as warm. Temperatures dipping to 14 to 16 Celsius, England and Wales, 12 or 13 for Scotland and Northern Ireland. There will be an area of rain affecting the northeast of Scotland for a time on Thursday morning. That gets out of the way. And then it's a day of bright spells and scattered showers, most of those showers affecting northern areas. Similar conditions on Friday. And then by the weekend, it turns drier and brighter widely.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment. We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hello there, it's 6 o'clock. I'm Michelle Dewberry, and this is Jubes & Co, the show where we'll get into some of the things that have got you talking today. Now, Nicola Sturgeon, what's your view on her? Is she someone who should simply be ignored? An attention seeker, if you will. Well, that is the case according to Liz Truss yesterday. It has sparked fury, so it has, in Scotland, with many people saying perhaps she's not taking the union seriously. Where do you stand on it? Also, Liz Truss last night was busy making lots of kind of promises, thoughts, ideas, policies.